Now, obviously, hence the title of this video, there is no Na'Vi era with these 5 players, and with the whole Boomich news, looks like these 5 players are done as a 5-man unit. We're moving into a different type of Na'Vi, and so we reset all the narratives. It's time for a new attempt at being the best team, at being a team that can have an era, a team that works around simple as the best player, all that jazz. Because realistically, as soon as Na'Vi lost the PGL Antwerp final to FaZe, that just put the final full stop, the period at the end of the sentence, on the premise of Na'Vi having an era, and it said, unfortunately, no, they did not have an era. Now, even if they'd won, I think it's still a debate whether it's an era, but you could maybe have sort of made the angle and the argument, and the fact that, like, only really IEM was one that they lost without losing to FaZe. I think you could maybe have made it work. Even then, maybe you need to win a couple of tournaments afterwards. But since it didn't happen, it's irrelevant at this point in time. It's over. There will be no Na'Vi era. Now, that is very significant in a bunch of contexts. One, they've had some very good Na'Vi teams in CSGO, even some elite teams, even teams that have been number 1 or around number 1, number 2, number 3 in the world. But they've never had the era. They've never had the dominant period in time. Even when they've won tournaments in a row, they never had anything truly approaching era. This was the first time Na'Vi in CSGO had a squad that could have had an era and was looking set for it. Obviously, people might know Na'Vi, the organisation, began in Counter-Strike, if we go back to Counter-Strike 1.6, with an era, with the legendary Marklov, Senia, Zeus, Starix, Edward lineup that won the 4 majors in a row, won the first 5 major finals in a row, broke the prize money record in 2010, were just a truly incredible team. Then you think about this. This is the first time Simple's been on a team that truly could have had an era. Like, this guy, the whole narrative of his career is his teammates are never quite good enough, or he doesn't have the best team around him, or someone else has a better team situation or better teammates around them. So this was a guy where, like, for the last 3 years before this attempt at an era, the story was always, okay, it's the best team, could be Gambit, could be Team Liquid, could be, obviously, at one point in time, could have been FaZe Clan, could be Astralis, right? Whoever this team is, they're number 1, they're the best team, but they're playing the best player in Simple. Now you had the best team was Na'Vi, and the best player Simple was on Na'Vi. So it gave it a totally different dimension, and you wanted to see what actually happens when the best player in the world plays on the best team for, say, 2 years, a year or two, gets a nice period of time under his belt. Whereas realistically now, like, bearing in mind, most people are going to say, even before the end of this attempt at an era, the whole conflict in Ukraine essentially means, like, it sort of ripped out some of the underbelly of this narrative that they'd have an era. Realistically, you only got, what, 4 or 5 actual months of real LAN circuit with that kind of a setup. And he won every single LAN during the first portion. And then we had this dip where he didn't win any LANs and they didn't get the era. So what an underwhelming way for that to all play out, right? You don't entirely feel, and this is the worst part about their era getting crushed, you don't entirely feel like it's just because of how they played or how someone else played against them to beat them. There's this external factor that's very cruel, right? So let's have a look at what could have been, because if you actually look at what they did have, I think people actually have slightly underrated what they did do. Like, let's be real, it is over. There's no point, because first of all, the Boomich news ends the lineup, but then secondly, they failed the major and they haven't won a LAN event in 2022, and we've now had 3 significant LANs. But you look at the 3 LANs we did have. You had IM Katowice. Well, they still made top 4 there. It's a very good result. Also, you shade in, that was in the playoffs when the whole conflict stuff began, which meant that as a result, by the way, I actually didn't even think it would be G2 against Na'Vi in the semis. I actually thought VP was looking really hot at that tournament prior to the whole conflict thing beginning, and I thought they looked underwhelming after map 1 against G2. So I thought VP was going to edge out G2 and then play an epic series against Na'Vi in the semis. I would favour Na'Vi to win that. So I think there's a world where Na'Vi could have been in the final of this tournament. I don't think and also, if the whole conflict thing hadn't happened, look, we can't know because in Blast they weren't too hot, but that was just an online tournament. Yes, they had the play break. Maybe that impacted them. That does reset people. But you figure, like, give them a couple of tournaments, they would have gotten back to something approaching that form, which I'm not quite sure if they ever truly managed to hit after the conflict stuff began. So there's a world where IM Katowice is a very different tournament already. I think it also would have been better to lose to FaZe in the final and just only lose LANs in terms of being eliminated by FaZe. That would help your storyline. Then you had ESL Pro League. Now, in this one, they only finished 5th to 8th. That sounds whack until you realise they won their group going 5-0 in best of 3 series. And then in the quarterfinals, they drew FaZe Clan because FaZe Clan came out of their own group in 3rd place and then beat out I think it was actually the players' team, right? It was the ex-Gambit lineup in the round before this. So how's that Na'Vi's fault? And they lost against a team that won both the LANs at that point in the year, somehow playing them in the round of 8, and because you did better in your group and they did poorly. Like, in that scenario, you could easily have been the second best team in that tournament, but you end up finishing 5th to 8th, and people like Ens get to make a claim over you that I don't really know is justified if you look at who they played and who bit. So I already think the Pro League result is actually underrated. Then you have the major itself. Now look, there's so many angles you can go with on this. Like, for a start off, they did almost lose in the quarterfinals of the major. I thought they could have lost in 2 maps to Heroic. That really could have happened. Simple wasn't having the greatest series. Electronic really pulled his arse out the fire. Okay, so you don't go out in the round of 8, which could have happened. Then, I think there's a world where they almost won the tournament, because I think if they win that Inferno game, it'd be very interesting if there's a third map Ancient available in that series. I'd love to see how FaZe would have held up under that pressure, and that would be enormous. That could have potentially been a breaking point. That actually, I think, might have favoured Na'Vi if they'd gone to Ancient as the decider at that point in time. So then there's the world where they almost win the tournament. By the way, I don't think it takes that much for them to win the tournament. Like, Simple played really poorly in that final. In fact, if you go and look, the 3 times they lost to FaZe, they won one. They won in that like group decider at Katowice, the one that just decides if you skip to the semis or go straight to or have to play the round of 6 match, which obviously FaZe lost that one to Na'Vi, but Na'Vi was beaten by FaZe and all the others, right? The Katowice one, which is the one that FaZe lost, whatever. The ESL Pro League one, also, by the way, another game where actually Simple wasn't that great. The only game, by the way, Simple looked mega in, I think, was actually the series where they stomped him in Katowice. That was the only one where he went bonkers. So if you think you expect more than that from Simple, even though he's been a brilliant player generally this year, in these big matches, actually he's had letdown games, letdown series, and there haven't been people always there to rescue him in the ones against FaZe. So I think if he even plays a bit better, they maybe win or go even in those ones or have a better chance to win. Now, another thing to notice is, not only could they have potentially won all these tournaments? I mean, even the games against FaZe, look, they weren't the closest the games FaZe played, but they were always competitive games. Not only could they have won these LANs, I think could have come top 2 or top 4 or all of them, depending on the bracket. You even look on LAN, they played something like 17 best of 3 series. They've won 13 of them, guys. Then, out of the 13 series they've won, something like, let me think, what was it? I think it was 8 out of 13 times. They just 2-0'd the opponents. It's not even like everything's touch and go. They're losing loads of people. You go and look who's actually beaten them, right? They've lost 4 series on LAN. They lost 1 online to NIP, but who really cares about that? So on LAN, they've lost to FaZe twice at the Major and at EPL. They've lost to Heroic at the RMR in a 3-map series, close still. And they lost to G2 right after the conflict thing had started. And 2 of the times they were eliminated, it was by FaZe Clan, the team that won all the LANs prior to IEM Dallas. So I think you look at it, outside of that, it's not like they can't beat FaZe. They've beaten FaZe at IEM. They've beaten ENCE twice. They beat him at IEM, beat him at PGL. It's, by the way, is number 2 in the world right now. Heroic's one of the better teams. Heroic beat them, right? They beat Heroic at the EPL. They beat Heroic at the PGL Major itself. They beat Vitality when it was at the RMR, when people were vaguely thinking they would be a good team. They've beaten NIP, who's beaten them online, but they beat them at the PGL, obviously. Like, they've been able to get wins across top teams. There's only really FaZe realistically stopping them, or slight underperformance by Na'Vi. So you look at it all in all, I actually think people have underrated this Na'Vi squad a little bit. I think they've been crying a little bit too much because they didn't win the tournaments. Then you look at their map pool. Look, their map pool does show they had their issues. Like, individually, Bit wasn't quite as much of a monster on LAN. Electronic was a little bit more up and down on LAN, and online was a lot worse. But you look at the map pool, they're unbelievable on Mirage. Still arguably the best team in the world on that map, by the way. Ancient, they were undefeated on the last 3 months. Dust, they were 5-1. Now, here's where it gets dodgy. Inferno used to be one of their best. They actually had a losing record on that. They went 4-5 over the last 3 months. They won 3-1 on Overpass. By the way, it's supposed to be a map you can punish pick against them. But they were 3-4 on Nuke. Nuke and Inferno, 2 of their main maps last year. That used to be a former stronghold. That was the one they had combined between online and offline play. 20 map wins in a row going through to Blast World Finals last year. Now they're in a scenario where they're losing that map. 3 out of 7. Fucking hell, what? 4 losses out of 7. This used to be a monster map for them. And then Vertigo, they don't play, was always their permaban. So realistically, the key thing you see is they can still get wins on maps like Inferno Nuke if they had to play them. If you want maps like Mirage, Ancient, Dust 2, they just beat everyone. Like Mirage, Ancient, and Dust 2, they have a combined 3 losses and they've got 21 wins. So you can see they frag out when they still have to. They still have enormous firepower. They can still beat more squads. I actually think it's kind of rough for this Na'Vi team. I think this really will be looked at as a huge what if, maybe the biggest what if ever in CSGO. I think ultimately, if you look how close they were and how few things had to go right, even with the losses, even after what we've seen, to potentially get them to an era, to establish what they needed, to put them in that higher place in history. So let's be real. This is a missing era. This could have been an era for Na'Vi that now won't happen. And the worst part is, the period where they established what was going to be the era was the weakest part of the LAN circuit in many years, so people won't look at that as sexy. Like they'll say, who were you competing against? What, G2 that needed a roster move, Vitality that desperately needed roster moves, Heroic who hasn't done it, and Gambit who just doesn't win the big studio LANs. Like, yeah, you can take all those aspects away, and suddenly how dominant they were doesn't look as sick, right? Then consider this. The first event that they didn't win was where the conflict bullshit began. And it began right at the playoff portion. They hadn't played any playoff rounds yet. So let's be real. Maybe Na'Vi wouldn't have been as good. Maybe the field getting stronger in terms of the other teams would have made a difference and cost them some titles or their era. I mean, for a start off, there was no ROPS on FaZe Clan, right? Then you go and you look, G2, Vitality, all these squads hadn't made their moves. They had the break. The player break often resets players. Go ask Team Liquid players about that. Having time off just changed how things go. There's the whole cycle of what maps do we like at the moment. Obviously, they were moving away from the nukes of the world. In this case, maybe they were moving into Ancient fully. There's the whole tactical cycle. People have had a long time to study your demos. People have seen you at your best. You switch some of those things now. You switch up some of your second vetoes, etc. Suddenly you map, change this map out. You play this other map instead. There would have been certain factors that affected whether he was good. But this is brutal. Then you got to add in, it's not like they didn't only worst play on the Na'Vi side and then everything else stayed the same. FaZe also rose up and became this monster team that wins mega clutch matches, 2 of them against the guys from Na'Vi. So I think the roughest thing for me about what could have been the era for Na'Vi is this. It could have been one of the best starts to an era we ever saw. They won all the LANs. They overcame the team that was ahead of them, the Gambit squad that was their final boss. They won a major without losing a map. No one had ever done it in history. They had the best player in the history of CSGO, still in arguably his absolute prime. And if they could have somehow gotten Antwerp, they could have won back-to-back majors. Hell, if they won a couple of the tournaments this year, they'd have been in position to go back-to-back Grand Slams, which no one has ever done. So this Na'Vi team, really, the sky was the limit. They could have done absolutely everything. I'll even say this. I do think as a raw peak, they will be considered one of the greatest, a contender for greatest team of all time. The trouble is not getting that full era and not completing it against the scene after it cycled a bunch of roster moves and had a break and come to another major. I do think it costs them. If you look at the Astralises, the NIPs, the Fanatics of the world who won it over many years, they did the bounce backs, people made roster moves to counter them or tactically changed things or did the veto differently, and they had their responses, which is one of the reasons why those are the greatest teams of all time. I also think the saddest and the most cruel thing about it is, even though they're going to keep the talents, apparently, hopefully the Russian players, the lineup they had, the fact that we knew it worked and they could win and they could make those 3 stars operate at the same time, I think they had some of the most firepower ever seen in CSGO. As I often draw the comparison, that trio of simple, bit and electronic, that is like when Barcelona had fucking Messi, Neymar and Suarez at the same time and they were just banging in goals left, right and centre all the time. You felt like that. Like if they play their game, you just will not win. They will win. They've too much talent and they can make it all work at once in the server. That could have been an incredible era if they'd been able to pull it off. So you think of past eras that were or could have been. FaZe has obviously failed outright. That was way more shaky ground than this, even though in some senses they were closer because they were so close to so many of them. NIP, the game itself just developed and they obviously got to try that entire lineup as long as they wanted, pretty much, beyond the fact they fired for Thorin, but I think they fired him actually late, if anything. SK didn't have an era. I changed my mind on that one. Team Liquid blew theirs because they couldn't get one of the 2 majors, specifically the Starlighter one was costly and they didn't even go deep enough in them. Fnatic just ran out of steam as a lineup and changed the players, brought in Dennis and had a different revival, but I had to acknowledge that their era was over and they'd lost quite a few times. Astralis burned themselves out, came back for another mini attempt in an era, but then we went online, and then their lineup just never survived. I think Astralis, you could maybe even say they were the closest with the second run, having another one. You could even throw in the Astralis 2017 team, which only really fell apart because, actually, funnily enough, Carrigan's FaZe team came along and became good and won out a bunch of clutch games. Oh, we're starting to sound familiar. But anyway, my problem is this. I actually think in some ways, as painful as the Na'Vi era not happening is, especially if you've been a fan of Simple's play over the years, I actually think on some level, if FaZe can have an era and FaZe can secure that, actually that might in some ways almost narratively make up for it. It might make people think, well, maybe FaZe would have been the better team anyway. It'll be more sort of it'll be easier to accept mentally that the passing of the baton took place in the matches that we saw, which cost Na'Vi their era. Somehow I think that would almost feel fairer, right? In the same way as when FaZe failed to get their own era, who got the era instead? Well, at the same time period, we had the transition to Astralis becoming number one, and Astralis was able to get the era, right? So I think it's actually a tragic scenario because some of it isn't in the game stuff, and we'll never know how much of it was in the game stuff. But Na'Vi did not have the era, unfortunately. This episode was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio, Rajcula, Kyle R, Travis Goff, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Pacy, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Tooorin, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Want to suggest a topic or a guest? Would you like to ask a question in one of those AMAs I do? Maybe you want to find out who the upcoming guests are for my interviews, or you'd like to be part of one of those long discussions with yours truly. Well, if any of these perks appeal to you or others, check out the description box link below to Patreon and put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today.